Hi, welcome everybody and good afternoon. This is a conversation about how design and architecture matter in the age of COVID. Here in the College of Arts, Media and Design at Northeastern, across the last 12 months, like all of you, we've been dealing with a pandemic that's highlighted domestic and international inequalities. So these months have also been a time of reflection and of reckoning, with a special focus on the past and presence of racism. And of course, across these same months, we've had a lot of deep mistrust in institutions, including the US election and the healthcare system. It's also been a time inviting evolving conversations about how we might shape a better future. There are so many discussions going on about what will happen after the pandemic, about how the pandemic has reshaped our sense of life and work. There's an interesting recent article in The Economist, for example, about what history tells you about post-pandemic booms. And what left out to me in the article was the indication of a historical pattern that pandemics encourage people and businesses to try new ways of doing things, upending the structure of the economy. Which brings us to the conversation today. As a dean here at Northeastern, I'm pleased to moderate the conversation with our panelists and the audience. What's particularly exciting at CAMD is that we have faculty whose work intersects in such interesting way with these issues of such vital relevance to all of our futures. Dan Adams is director of the School of Architecture at Northeastern, which focuses on educating students and advancing research on all scales of architectural design for achieving sustainable built environments. Within the school, Professor Adams teaches courses on urban design. He's also the founding partner of Landing Studio, an architecture and urban design practice that focuses on the design of urban infrastructure systems. Some examples of current projects include the redesign of Charles Gate Park and restoration of the Muddy River in Boston, the reconstruction of the North Jetty Pier and Marine Terminal in South Boston, the under-highway public space in Albany, New York, and the design of salt mining headquarters in Northern Ireland. Sara Carr is Assistant Professor of Architecture, Urbanism, and Landscape at the School of Architecture, where she's also Program Director for the Master of Design in Sustainable Urban Environments. Her research focuses on the intersection of health, disease, and the built environment, particularly as they overlap with the effects of climate change on the urban landscape. Since the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, she's been interviewed and cited by outlets ranging from the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the BBC, NPR, and CNN. She has a forthcoming book, The Topography of Wellness: How Health Shaped the American Urban Landscape, which is due out in September of 2021 from the University of Virginia Press. And last but not least, Kristian Kloeckl is Design and Associate Professor with a joint appointment between the School of Architecture and the Department of Art and Design, as well as Director of the Experience Design Lab and core faculty of CAMD's Center for Design. He's principal investigator in a 4-year NSF-funded Future of Work research project and is leading a new collaboration on experience design and data visualization with the Museum of Fine Arts Center for Netherlandish Art. He's led numerous research projects around cities and digital technologies, as well as design for future workplace environments. And he's a member of the Boston Design Museum Workplace Innovation Think Tank. He's also author of the book, The Urban Improvise: Improvisation-Based Design for Hybrid Cities, published by Yale University Press in 2020. And with no further ado, let's get started. So, as a first question, how have you seen the impacts of COVID-19, the pursuit of racial justice, and climate change awareness intersect in the built environment? And let's ask Dan Adams to get us started.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Dean Hudson, I should say. And
Elizabeth, please.
No, and I want to say I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues from the College of Arts, Media and Design, and I'm also delighted, as I've just scrolled through the participants, to see students, alumni, faculty, et cetera. And I think Elizabeth's asking sort of the question of the day for us in the built environment. And I think to answer that question, I think the first thing, Elizabeth, is the kind of realization that those things do intersect, and the kind of growing recognition of that in our disciplines. And maybe that's sort of silly or embarrassing that it's taken a pandemic like that, like this, to sort of bring that to the forefront. But I think that's what has probably been most profound for us in the design disciplines in the last year, is that, human health, justice of the environment, and the growing climate crisis are also sort of deeply intertwined, in that, in fact, we've, in many ways, the way we've built the environment has really sort of brought those things into intense friction with each other. There's sort of a term that I think we've been starting to use more and more in the sort of built environment design that I like a lot, and that is this sort of notion of people first in the thinking of architecture and infrastructure, especially as we look to kind of coming out of these circumstances. So, we had a similar, let's say, crisis in 2009 of sorts with the Great Recession. And it was very different. That was in many ways a very sort of financially wrought crisis. This is very different. This is a very sort of human wrought crisis. And I think what's kind of amazing when we look at the federal initiatives now and the sort of funding, be it across transportation or energy sectors, is the realization that, like, yes, we obviously, with the climate crisis, need to think about energy systems, but we have to think about that from a perspective of human health and health of the planet, right? Not just, how do we sort of lower the cost of energy, for example, or even lower emissions, but think about how, as we implement new energy infrastructure in the country, it prioritizes the health of the planet and health of people. And I'm, I guess, very optimistic and reassured by that kind of awakening about a people first mentality, right at a time when people are really making moves to be progressive and make big change. And I'm sure Sara has many things to comment on that.
Yeah, Sara, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, interestingly enough, I've been thinking about how, my personal research journey, looking at health in the built environment, actually started almost 16 years ago when I was living in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. And at that time, I was, working as an architect a few years out of architecture school, and doing healthcare facilities. And in that time, I had seen how, in a very controlled, right, and very closed environment, that the built environment had acute effects on patients, right, but also on doctors and nurses, if we're talking about stress and the way they move around a hospital. So that's what I was doing in New Orleans and the Gulf South when Hurricane Katrina hit. And I think that was my first realization that these three things do intersect. Exactly. Climate change, health, and racial justice, although, admittedly, that dimension has not been made so acute for me until recently. But it was then that I wanted to take that work that I was doing in the healthcare sector and think about how can it be applied on the public level? How can it be applied on the urban landscape level? Even after doing this research for many years, I don't know if I could have foreseen that an infectious disease, especially in sort of a developed country, would bring all those issues back together again. My hope is that, even though it's been an extraordinarily difficult year, that it shifts the needle on a lot of these things, because we've really seen it up close. And I think remembering that, again, these three issues, racial justice, climate change, and health, also acutely affect the same populations over and over again. And so how can the built environment work as a piece of public infrastructure to start to build equity in the built environment? And just as Dan was talking about it, I think that takes a people first strategy. And I think we'll talk about this a little more later, but it's great to see, this current generation, the students at Northeastern University, really interested in those issues. So I think they are the future of the profession, and we're definitely trying to guide them as best as we can.
I love the formulation of people first. And I also love the idea that there's a sort of larger public awareness of it all. Kristian Kloeckl, would you like to add any words to this?
Sure. You asked about the impact on place and on urban space, and the thing that stands out to me, and I was saying before that we've got 50 minutes to talk about the impact of major things on design architecture, so we'll scratch the surface of some, and it's also important to underline that there's so many different issues we won't even get to, so there's no ranking in terms of importance by the issues that we raise. But what stands out to me is that our cities are empty. There are no people in cities. An Atlantic article, or Boston Globe, I think, a couple of weeks ago indicated that 90% of Manhattan offices are empty. 90% of Manhattan offices are empty. Office workers working from home. And that's one city. It has different repercussions in different cities. This pandemic has struck us at a time that in the US has been often titled as a renaissance of urban life and urban space. And so seeing our cities emptied of people is one of the striking impacts that I see that we see in terms of the urban space and physical space of our cities, and people working from home, large companies, Ford, Target, others, giving up office space and indicating already now that they will never plan to return to an in-person workplace as there was before the pandemic. Remote work, and we can talk about that, having worked to get us through a pandemic, perhaps surprisingly. But on the other end, and that's a tension for me in this a bit, recent survey that was indicated in the Atlantic indicated how 2/3 of people that work from home indicate that their cons of working from home outweigh the pros, and 70% indicated that they experience stress by having the combination of work in their home life and family life. So there's the issue of mental health, of social animals like all of us are, suddenly being on our own in confined spaces at home on the one hand, and workplace realities that have been changed radically by all of the work having been brought home, or much of this office work having brought home. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested that we are in a moment of radical change of how we work that considers knowledge industries, creative industries, office work, and where I see an interesting opportunity for all of us in the design, in the architecture sphere, to engage in reformulating through a conversation of how we want work to take place, what form to have work to take place between remote, in-person, and various other constellations. I see this as an opportunity, but it's a staggering reality in terms of the impact so far.
It's really fantastic and interesting. I think what some of you have already been raising is this question of exactly the responsibility that the people involved, architecture and design, have for good and bad effects, right? Exactly what unintended consequences they have for exactly these things are working out. I mean, both some of the examples that have already been raised. So can you comment more on, exactly what the effects might be for how things might be either good or bad for the effects on through the built environment for these issues?
Yeah,
Dan,
I mean,
you wanna start?
yeah, sure. No, I mean, one of the things we talk a lot, I think, in school, but in architecture more and more, is another term I love, which is footprint, right? Is really recognizing, like, what is it that you do as a designer or an architect, and it's so easy to kind of look at, let's say, the physical thing in front of you that you design. And then the question becomes like, well, who's impacted by that? Where did those materials come from? What are the kind of ramifications of what you put into the environment? And I think that really, again, ties to this question of sort of people first today. I'm thinking about, obviously with the changeover of parties and the kind of major stimulus funds that are being put together right now in this country, there's a lot of focus on like transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure. And the questions that I think are really coming out of, again, this intersection that you raised, Elizabeth, are really dynamic and interesting of, oh, okay, the highways, we're coming to the end of life of highways across the country. Do we tear them down? Okay, well, if we tear them down, that creates complex new social structures in those environments where there's actually communities, largely Black communities in cities that are actually very vulnerable, that if those highways are torn down, property values go up. It's if we replace the highways with parks, it's often referred to now as green gentrification. And the questions start to become, okay, well, so what's the responsibility then as a designer to, let's say, not just design the removal of the highway and the beautification of that area, but making a sustainable community before you do that, so that so what actually seems like a great design move for both the health of the people that's there, the representation of the people that's there, doesn't displace the very people that you're trying to help. And it's one of those, I think, great examples of this kind of intersection right now between, trying to look at what are those underlying health parameters, like breathing exhaust from a highway, and trying to fix that so that when pandemics like this hit in the future, they're maybe less damaging. Restore the economy by essentially fueling investment in areas, improve all sorts of parameters for mobility in cities, and yet in those improvements, don't damage the people that you're in fact aiming to help. And I think those kinds of questions are almost like defining the next generation of designers. They certainly are what I think a lot of our students are looking at now, is to not just sort of look at the physical characteristics of a design, but the social and environmental impacts that will be wrought through those designs.
Yeah,
So, and I'm going to say something because I know all of you have so much to say, but I think it's such an interesting pivot right now in relationship to how we think about this as an educational institution, right? Which is where you're pointing towards, right? There's so much that we can talk about in terms of specifically how are we forecasting the disciplines of architecture and design and a responsibility in relationship to the teaching of these disciplines. Because what you guys are talking about is how immensely complex and in how many sort of multi-disciplines the responsibility and the relationships sort of point towards. So Sarah, I'll turn it to you next to give you the floor.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add on Dan's point is like, I'm really always hesitant to call it an opportunity, right? Even though it's exciting, right? That maybe we're thinking about the intersection of these issues, just the tragedy of the past year. I can't call it an opportunity, but I think as Dan has pointed out, what it is an inflection point, right? There's a real, it's a real fork in the road right now, which way we go, right? That we are aware of how these issues compound, especially with communities of color. Dan was talking about highway removal, right? And we also know that asthma that has been born on these communities from road infrastructure also makes them vulnerable to COVID-19. So I think one thing we can think about is what we do know, and what's interesting is, 115 years ago, 100 years ago, when we were still very much fighting epidemics on an environmental level, right, brought us a lot of the changes that we still enjoy here in Boston. So Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect, the designer of the Emerald Necklace, the Back Bay Fens, which is right at the feet of Northeastern University's campus, and is such a wonderful sort of laboratory that we bring our students to, because really those designs have so much resonance today. Frederick Law Olmsted had a background in public health, and so he designed his parks with that in mind, with this idea of bringing fresh air into the city, about providing public space to people. What happened after that, with the advent of germ theory, is we started to decouple the environmental impact, right, of architecture and landscape on illnesses, because we thought it was, very much treated on the individual level. And what we found with COVID-19 is that it's still very relevant. Another advancement that was made in the 1918 flu pandemic was open air classrooms and ventilation, right? And if those of us in New England look around your house, if you see radiators under your windows, that's because they were designed so you could open your windows during the flu pandemic, and the radiators would sort of make like a little heat curtain in front of it, right? Because they also knew the importance of fresh air ventilation here. And again, we're seeing the extreme relevance of that, when we talk about the issues of schools reopening. So the truth is there are several aspects of the built environment. There are tested solutions, and they all tend to sort of center on the same qualities, and that is ventilation, green space, access, right? So the idea of how we bring those in, I think it's very exciting and can address, again, those three issues that we see intersecting right now.
So what do you think?
I think to take this forward, I do think, and Elizabeth, I'm connecting to what you prompted us before. I do think there is a tremendous opportunity, and one that actually we in the role of as teachers will need to find ways to work with productively, and that is that there will be now a young generation. I'm talking about kids that are now 8, 10, 12, 14 years old, that have gone in their early life through an experience that from one day to the other, everything can radically change in their everyday life. Institutions that perhaps others of us have gotten to know as more stable and enduring over time, like school, like mobility, can just change. Parents' work and the way they work just changes. Parents are at home inventing their own ways to work. Schools are inventing their own ways to connect students. I think this will really be an imprint on a younger generation, that they grow up with this sense that things can change, and also that you can change things and you can invent yourself ways to deal with these changes in a way that I think hasn't occurred to such a scale for a while. And that is a great opportunity, since design always has to do with introducing change and critically looking at how we do things and how we live, and through a process of critical conversation and exchange, finding, defining, articulating new ways in which we can do things. And I think there's a great opportunity and an opening now to have designers and future design generations that have experienced this ability of changing things radically, and a larger public that has gone through this experience, that work does not necessarily need to be the way it used to be. School does not necessarily need to be the way it used to be. So there's a big opportunity for radical change. Consumption does not necessarily need to be the way it used to be. There's been a big turn towards local sourcing of groceries in a moment where, perhaps to the surprise of many of us, sophisticated supply chains in our grocery supply system, kind of collapsed, at least temporarily, or had issues with an increase of people turning to alternative ways of sourcing food. And I think this is a great opportunity for future generations of designers to really radically rethink on how we want to live, how we want to live together, how we want to do things together, and a challenge for, I think, us as teachers to engage in this kind of new conversations that will come up.
I think that's a really good point. And I guess one question then that follows is, have you seen particular ways in which, in light of these changes already, you've seen students' interests shift, and you see the particular impact for how we should be teaching architecture and design differently in the future in response to these shifts? So I don't know, Dan, if you want to start with that, specifically as leading the School of Architecture.
Yeah, sure. No, and I mean, I think that's what I love about this kind of people first concept, right? Because, so I do a lot of work with, let's say, highway infrastructure and ports. And, after World War II, there was just like a major boom in this country to reshift resources to essentially build infrastructure to stimulate the economy. And it was like a major building boom, as I think we all know. And then 2008, and that in many ways was about building infrastructural capacity. So that was maybe the mission. And then 2008, 2009, it was post-recession. We had the American Recovery Act. It was stimulate the economy, get people back to work, right? But it was, again, sort of an economic driver. And I think what we're seeing right now is really very different. And I like Sara's term, kind of point of inflection, because we're looking and we're saying, yeah, we need to do that. We need to rethink our infrastructure. We need to reinvest in the country and the world in new ways. But it's got to be from sort of a humanist, creative, full contemplation and acceptance of our kind of footprint on us as a society and a culture. And so that it kind of reorients the goals. It's not an economic goal. It's not a, build tons of capacity goal. It's support people's health. And that is, I think, I have the privilege in my role of, I see, I read the application essays of our students of like, why are they interested in coming into architecture and the design fields? And the thing that blows me away every year when I get to read those essays is what the students talk about is not, oh, I want to like, some of course, but not want to like make beautiful buildings for the sake of beautiful buildings. They've made the connection, and maybe it's to Kristian's point to some degree of just watching the world, that they want to have a significant role actualizing change in this environment, not talking about change, writing about change. They want to see like tangible, actionable change. And I'm always sort of very proud of the students and of our discipline, perhaps, that they see design and architecture as that moment of translating from sort of theory and concept of, let's say, human empowerment, social justice, but they see like, no, I want to physically change the environment. I want to change the context. And I think these are the disciplines that can sort of facilitate that translation from concept and theory to actualization on the ground, maybe from theory to practice.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I mean, Dan and I have been talking to some of the architecture students over the past few weeks, and I think what's really interesting, I mean, not to betray anybody's ages here, but 20 years ago, right, when we were in design school or architecture school, it was a very different philosophy, especially in architecture, that, there was this sort of idea that, a lone designer, hero architects, right, so very like high design, and it was not seen as, and I give all credit to Dan's leadership, especially at the School of Architecture, to telling students that it's a service profession. Design is a service profession. And I think we've seen a real shift in that too, in thinking about students that are interested in different kinds of users, right? Like just yesterday, I had a student, or sorry, not yesterday. Yesterday was the final presentation, but earlier this week, I was talking to a student, and of her own accord, she had started designing a boardwalk and a viewing platform, and she suddenly realized, she said, well, it's not wheelchair friendly, and she wanted to show people in wheelchairs that were using her site, and it sort of like dictated this last minute design change, because she was putting herself in the place of other users. I would say the other tension, and it's been especially difficult this year, but we've also heard from so many students too that are really interested in public engagement and community engagement. And as Dan knows, it's actually been a challenge, especially in a pandemic year, right? That we're trying to put some guardrails around it, right? We're trying to give students those tools so they can go forward, but we don't want to launch ourselves into communities, especially vulnerable communities. But we see this real, I think, this real drive from the students that they want to talk to people, that they want to understand how they use spaces. And I would say that's been a big shift in architectural education that, the three of us have always been interested in a long time. And now we see this moment where the students are meeting us there, and they want to learn those tools, and they will take it forward with them in the profession, which I think is so inspiring.
Yeah, fantastic. I guess one of the questions that seems really interesting, and as you're referring to this a little bit already, so much about the students' experience, about all of our experiences, is in terms of, as just this past year, we have been experiencing work and schooling through this sort of weird virtual experience of space. What we're all in right now, right? We're experiencing this through particular ways of experiencing space. And it seems like you guys are all experts in teaching about ways of thinking about experiencing space. So I'm wondering about how much you talk about the ways in which this year of experiencing work and schooling virtually has altered our perceptions of space, and how that changes how you think about the work in the fields, and thinking and getting students to engage with and thinking about space itself and how you shape space.
Yeah, we've become experts without ever thinking we would, in terms of remote education, I guess, and teaching. Well, in my experience, that relates to teaching, and in conversations with people that work in industry in contexts such as design agencies, they've made a similar experience as well. There's a lot of collaboration going on there that parallels that in some way. For me, there were sort of two poles in this. One was a big surprise by how well digital communication technologies have actually held up and allowed us to go through this pandemic by remotely interacting and keeping activities afloat, learning continuing to happen. So that was surprising. To bring it down, I was surprised Zoom didn't crash once we all went remote. The interface design, interaction design has proven it's reached a high level. At the same time, going through this experience has made it abundantly clear what we're lacking by only being limited to these digital communication tools. They're great tools to get communication across. They're really bad tools for social interaction, for human camaraderie, for being together with people. They've got the real limitations. And so that's been a bit the experience at a higher level that I've had. These technologies, these digital communication technologies have been great to get us through this pandemic, I think, in terms of 100%. They're great to contribute, to be an element in our work, in our learning, in our interactions. They're absolutely not enough to substitute in-person interaction, being in the same room, experimenting, as in design and architecture is often the case, with materials, with prototypes, with enactment of services, interactive processes, sketching, the social role of sketches, of socializing ideas, quick interactions. This has been a lack. And I would say that's also been made very clear that as many of my colleagues have tried an incredible amount of collaborative software tools and suites with shared whiteboards and whatnot. I'd say nothing comes close to being in the same room with people, a table, pencil, paper, some material to work with. Yeah, and I see it in concrete terms now. We're working on this NSF project. We're developing a robotic prototype for an industrial workplace environment, and we're managing to do it. But we've all just recently acknowledged that it's a slower process, because only once we actually get there in person, we have this rapid interaction of ideas, of conversations, of discussions that it's much slower in a remote way.
I will say one advantage though, and I think Kristian touched on it though, is like what's actually been really great though is some things have gotten more horizontal. Like I've been able to bring in, guests from all over the country this year.
Right.
I feel like my classes have really benefited actually.
Yep.
Some of my classes, some aspects of the classes, not all, and I'll touch on that in a moment too, because sort of the instantaneousness of Zoom, we've been able to bring in, expert guest speakers, and, with reciprocity, I've been able to speak at other universities too and talk about what we're doing here at Northeastern. And so, going forward, I'm trying to think about, okay, what have we learned from this year and how can we take it when we are back in person in the classroom? And I do think there's no substitute for being in person in class. But there have been some advantages to that way, using more of these collaborative digital tools. discussion sections have been really hard teaching this year, but instead what I did in my classrooms was I tried to flip it. So I put all my lectures online instead, so the students had flexibility to watch it on their own terms, and took discussion sections online too, where they could work on collaborative documents and actually, put pictures in them. And we kind of did that as a precursor to talking on Zoom, and that helped. I would say one thing though that we have learned is, like, especially in architecture and in landscape where scale is so important, that's been very hard to translate this year into the studio. And I actually noticed it this week when my students were giving their final presentation. We're doing a project in Nantucket. Of course, the students have been able to go there this year. And one of the reviewers pointed out, and I started to realize, the students were doing gorgeous maps, right? They were doing beautiful maps, beautiful plans, even sort of transects across the whole island. Very few people had done perspectives, and usually perspectives, which is where you put you put somebody in space and you sort of like show them the experiential scale of the space. And I realized for the first time, none of the students have been able to do that, I think because we hadn't gone to the site, right? And they weren't sure about that translation to sort of like the mapping and the overview that we would get in Google Maps or, from the software that we're working in. So that was really interesting. And so I think I'm looking forward to sort of immersing students in site again that way, and thinking about how that affects design.
But I think here, even again, Elizabeth, goes right back to that sort of initial sort of, let's say, question you raised about the intersection of these issues. And I want to second, what Sara and Kristian both said on this sort of point of inflection. On like one hand, in our kind of, let's say, privileged position at Northeastern and with, our global students, there's been this amazing opportunity to engage with even their kind of globalness, right? Where in one class, you can literally be in like 10 countries at once, and students can be showing precedents from those areas. I mean, that has been unbelievably rich, right? And yet, I think what COVID and the climate crisis intersecting with racial and social justice has just sort of shown so much is just the sort of breaking points and those amazing inequities that just need to be considered as we kind of move forward on all these infrastructures. I mean, I reflected on it a lot, even in the virtual domain, right? And how dominant virtual has become in the built environment, where to even get like a vaccine, how much we all depend on the internet to have access to a vaccine. Or we've been dealing, Sara mentioned that a major interest is community engagement. And you mentioned like one project we're working on in Albany, New York right now, which is commonly the case in cities, public housing right up against the highways, working on the highways. We're trying to engage with the people in the public housing where they don't provide internet to the people in the housing. And so there's literally, the families have to get in cars, drive to parking lots near public buildings where they can access free Wi-Fi from their car, and kids are like going to school in cars, right? And so it's this kind of, again, the people first, like, yes. So, again, the kind of new administration in DC is putting a lot of notions in breaking down that digital divide in the internet of the built environment, which is like a contemporary form of sort of digital redlining in cities where there's investment. Those are, I think, the kind of really radically challenging questions that we're confronting, right? That like we've just spent 15 months for many people in a very virtual domain. There's like tons of lessons learned about the kind of opportunities and potentials of that. And then on the other end, the kind of extreme oppression, that a lot of people have confronted out of the failings of those infrastructure systems. And that's, I think those kind of, I think if there's one thing COVID has done in the last 15 months is really make very clear those very radical discrepancies. And so it's almost like, how do you learn the best possibilities from maybe the positives and really start to, use this as a point of sort of reflection to identify those really sort of troubling aspects at the other end.
Well, it's so interesting. There's all these questions about what has fundamentally changed about the built environment, or even about people's conception about the built environment. I think so much about young people and about how their fundamental perception of space, about the built environment, about what it should do might change. But maybe to ask you all to reflect on a more specific question that I know is sort of something that's talked about a lot, is about the future of cities. So much up until the last year, cities were talked about as places in which millions of people flocked. We talked about how more than half the world's population now lives in cities. And a lot about this pandemic has tended to change the narrative. Obviously, cities have locked down. You already have referred to the way in which so much of Manhattan space is empty. People have stayed away, they've moved elsewhere. So the big question is, what do you think will happen when we overcome the pandemic? Do you think people will be going back to cities, will be reanimating the public urban life? Or will cities have lost some of their attractiveness for good? So who wants to start off with that?
And I can start to take this. There's many angles to respond to that question. Before looking towards and after of the pandemic, though, I think in terms of criticism, self-criticism towards our own disciplines, myself having worked for many years in the space of cities and urban spaces and digital communication technologies, I have to say it's surprising that we all still remember that concept of smart city. I've criticized it a lot. I've written about it a lot. It's overpromised for long, but still remember that companies such as IBM said streets would repair themselves, cities would be all dynamic. It's surprising that there we go, there's a pandemic that requires us to socially distance, and rather to find ways to dynamically respond to that and find ways to reduce density, but to continue to make use of our cities and our public space. The only thing we can come up with is to all leave the cities, not going to public transport, not going to the offices. It's surprising to see, given to where we are and where we've been in terms of communication technologies and cities, that we didn't come up with ways to communicate levels of density in different parts of the city, that we didn't come up with ways to communicate levels of occupancy of office spaces to allow for, 30% of people to be in the office space together. So that's collapsed. And I do think, and I write about it in my book, that there's been just an emphasis on planning and control in the use of digital technologies in cities, rather than on prepare and improvise or respond in a dynamic way to a changing reality. I think moving forward, another thing I'm struck that it hasn't happened yet in some Asian cities during the past SARS outbreak, there was a switch towards staggered work start time, work hours. Surprisingly, again, it hasn't happened. I think that's something not only to address a pandemic, but to address shortage in public transportation. How can you make a public transportation network work without building more physical infrastructure, as Dan pointed to? Well, let's not all use it at the same rush hour. Let's have different workplaces start at different times and end at different times, and we'll get much more use out of it. So I think in terms of the tension of, I think there will be economic pressure from many companies trying to take this as an economic opportunity, a business opportunity to reduce in-person workplace environments, have people work from home. And on the other end, we have huge and exploding, I think, mental health issue that's developing in terms of depression, feelings of loneliness, substance abuse associated with people spending too much time alone at home. I think there's a big role for us to play, critical approaches in design and architecture to come up with new formats of how we want to live together, of how we want to work together in cities that will not be in person as it was before, probably, 5 days a week, 9 to 5, everyone in cities. But I hope, and I think it must not be entirely remote either. So I think, we and our students in our courses and then in their professional life have a huge opportunity to actively engage, to find new formats and formulate, articulate, propose new formats that combine in new ways, in beneficial ways, in fair ways, in ways that add value to as wide a participant group as possible, combining forms of being in person in the same room and remote in other places connected, with the various advantages, as Sara said before, because they exist also, but in new forms. I think there's a real opportunity to address this.
Yeah, I think, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was interviewed by the New York Times, and the first question was, is this the end of cities? And I just thought, well, the cities have never ended, right? Cities have always been a place of cultural capital where people gather, great public space, great public infrastructure. And I think, as Kristian was talking about, there is, again, I said I'd shy away from the whereabouts here. There's an opportunity to rethink, sort of, especially with the nature of work. And I would say specifically office work. I mean, it would be great if, as a result of the pandemic, we can also think about, how do we rethink work in, say, a meat packing plant, right? Or how do we rethink service industries, right? And frontline workers and grocery stores to be safer as well. But to speak to the topic of office work, where you can have a hybridized environment, maybe there's an opportunity here. Maybe offices, and we have to say, the city was always sort of positioned as a locus of disease way up until, almost the 1990s because of density so much. And I think, as Kristian was talking about before, we need a more nuanced way to talk about density, because there's different, density is different from, say, overcrowding, right? Which overcrowding is an issue, especially when you're talking about the pandemic. And density can take many forms. It can be a high rise, or it can be a 4-story sort of mixed use development, right? In a suburban town. But, it was recently that cities had actually become unaffordable for many populations, right? And for many companies as well. And so maybe as offices move out, as we rethink sort of flexibility in the workplace, I was reading an article in the Globe this morning thinking about, if offices take up a smaller footprint, maybe they're more likely to come into the city now that rents are falling a little bit, right? And maybe we actually have more offices working there, and there are people going to the city again, especially if this coincides with hopefully an investment in public transportation, which maybe that's the one sector of the built environment I worry the most about, just because, again, sort of like density is an invisible boogeyman. Public transportation, there hasn't been anything to address the fears around public transportation. And especially when you have the CDC saying, you should drive to work instead to keep yourself safe. That's where I talk about inflection point. It could still go either way in one moment, but maybe there's a chance here for cities to actually be more open to people as we think about flexibility in the built environment and different work patterns.
I know we could keep going, but Matt, I wonder if you could give us a couple of questions from the chat so we can bring the audience in.
Yep, go right ahead. So one of the questions that we had that was here was urban design influences disparities in healthcare and access. Prior to COVID, communities that were not affluent, rural, or minority would have lesser initiatives towards improving urban design to reduce these disparities. What are some steps that can be done post-COVID to address these previous norms, and what should be done to prevent the widening in disparities from design and architecture point of view?
So Dan, would you like to take this on? And I think the particular challenge is, as we care about these issues, specifically, how can design and architecture take a sort of particular stance in relationship to these issues?
Yeah, well, I think, one thing that sort of Sara identified is the notion of community engagement. And that's something we've reflected on a lot, right? Is how as designers to not sort of impose preconceptions of what makes a place resilient on those communities. And I also, like Sara mentioned, this notion of sort of service, right? And what is our role to sort of empower the communities where we're working? We're, in many ways, to kind of hand ourselves over as designers to those communities to help them achieve what they know is sort of, let's say, helpful to their environments. And I think that notion of community engagement I find really sort of powerful and strong, both in the sense of it's sometimes, thought of very specifically to kind of, you know, maybe the local neighborhoods or the people who live there. And that is obviously one aspect of strong community engagement. And then the other is, I think, something Northeastern does position itself quite well, is sort of interdisciplinary notions of community. And what does that sort of mean? And how do you bring different expertise to bear on a project? So for example, you know, some of the key things we're looking at, again, like, you know, there's a lot of movement right now with Pete Buttigieg as the new Secretary of Transportation in the country, talking about, as you know, highway infrastructure meets the end of its life, right? Or another big one is the energy sector domain, is as we invest in these resources, planning for what kind of community you hope will be sort of incentivized afterwards. And so architects need to be working with politicians, economists, public policy experts to set up, you know, let's say, housing trusts in those communities in advance, where land is pre-allocated to create affordable housing on a conception of pre-predicting rampant property growth changes in those areas, so that it's not just a matter of displacing communities that are there through the improvements, let's say, coming from federal investments. And that, I think, is just a really powerful, again, point of inflection, is, and I think is something we've been working on for a number of years, but maybe this is bringing new sort of players into the discussion about how it is as architects we engage with all of the kind of parameters of our footprint, not in that we become sort of experts in those subjects, but that we kind of open ourselves and give our services to those communities and those disciplines to create the kind of productive partnerships that can really tackle the full complexity of the equation that we're working in, that we don't sort of overly simplify our architectural and urban designs, but actually sort of open ourselves to work with the other people who maybe are tackling these through other dimensions of the built environment.
Sort of just to add on to that quickly, I would say one interesting thing about the pandemic is we're seeing a lot of architectural research play out in real time in terms of sort of the ad hoc ways that the built environment has been changed through the pandemic. So take outdoor dining, right? So dining on the street, closing off streets to extend parks. Thinking about grocery stores as more distribution centers, right? Than maybe a place that lots of people gather. And we can see how that works or how it doesn't work, who it advantages and who it doesn't advantage. So I don't know. I think that's one thing we can look at. We're seeing a lot of this play out in real time, I suppose, and thinking about what we end up sort of codifying in the built environment will take sort of keen observation and seeing what works and what doesn't.
I'm fascinated by this idea of ad hoc development of the built environment. Do you see ways in which you would engage with some sort of serious assessment of this ad hoc development and think about how you're actually assessing that with your students? Because it seems really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, prior to the pandemic, usually in my classes, we would do very structured public space observation. And those are methods, that have come from landscape architects and urban designers, such as Yin Gale, right, who has a whole book on sort of like how to observe public space. And there are protocols around that. And I think we try and bring that into our research methods in architecture where, it's kind of as simple sometimes as just staying in one spot and just with a map and just staying there for 2 hours and seeing like, where do people go, right? And not just about where do people go and what do they use, but who is using what aspects of the space. How do sun angles change across the space over that course of time, right? And does maybe say the warmth of the sun or the placement of a tree or a placement or the design of a bench, how does that change interactions? And I should say also, all originates with William White, a sociologist who did a social life of small urban spaces. And so, maybe there's a way we can apply that to a lot of these, sort of incremental, temporary urban interventions that we've seen come up during COVID.
Great, thanks. And I think we have time for one last question, perhaps, maybe two.
Yeah, so the next question that we had was, how does design and architecture intersect with other disciplines like economics, public health, to understand the trends we emerged from the pandemic?
Who wants to take that on? Sarah, do you want to try?
Yeah, Sarah, yeah.
In terms of the public health intersection?
With the public health intersection, yeah. So I mean, it's been prior to coming to Northeastern 2.5 years ago, I actually held a joint appointment in the School of Public Health and the School of Architecture. And I had one class where I put the two together, right? So it was half public health students, half architecture students. And there was a lot of tension and roadblocks at first. And something I realized is like, there's a lot of time we need to understand language. We need to understand policies, how they trickle down. And maybe that's something we're trying to address, more proactively, especially in the Sustainable Urban Environments program, is how do we teach designers who are also fluent in those languages? Because a lot of times it's a reciprocal relationship, but a lot of times design sort of comes downstream of these sort of systemic structures. And I think that's what is interesting about teaching in this time and teaching with these students that are interested in these topics is our students are interdisciplinary. We see more and more students that have combined majors come in too. And so I have students that are majoring not just in landscape architecture, but environmental engineering, in environmental science, right? And I've had anthropology students in some of my architecture classes. And so I think this generation is already interested in that sort of like porousness between disciplines, but it's important that we also teach our students in the language of these other disciplines and realize kind of the interdisciplinary environments that they will be working in the future.
Any other last?
I can add to that. Yeah, this design is inherently interdisciplinary, and to give just some examples in that. As Sarah mentioned, students come in with that curiosity already, and design in many ways is giving shape, giving form to relationships in the realm of human interactions, whether they're physical forms, whether they're immaterial forms, organizational forms. One example comes to mind during a design studio where we had the School of Architecture partner with Stanford's architectural program working on new workplace environments. I brought in a colleague from the business school who shared with the students his work on jobs, which was really insightful and interesting. He described from a business perspective how many things are connected to when a set of activities is declared to be a job, that then gets a job posting, gets a certain kind of workspace, an office space, a hierarchical positioning, and so forth. And that obviously translated then to students' work on workplace environments, in the physical shape and the interactions between that. Another example would be the current work we're doing on human-robot collaboration, design for human-robot collaboration in industrial work environments, not meat packing, but seafood processing, where we we bring together design students, architecture students, students from engineering, from the robotics domain, as well as psychology and social sciences, to give new shape and new form to work processes. Part of these shapes are physical, part are organizational or related to modalities of interaction. So I think this is just growing, and it's a great time to be in design field. These interdisciplinary aren't only recognized and accepted, but they're really sought after, both in, I think, academia in terms of the students, the faculty, as well as industry and outside world.
Listen, I know we're out of time. I think there's so much more that we can say. I think the bottom line is that we're at the beginning of I'll take Sarah's word, of an inflection point in which we really are going to be seeing a sea change. And I think it's exciting to think about the ways in which design and architecture have a really vital role to play in new ways of thinking. And we continue to need to be playing a vital role in thinking of dramatically new ways through interdisciplinary collaboration of changing the ways ways in which we engage, and I'm excited to be part of it. So I'll turn it over to Matt for our closing words.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for joining us, and a special thank you to our panelists. That was very enlightening, and to kind of hear about where the future is going.